morning, Christa.
Good morning, Jody.
Christa Marsik. Was Christa your baptismal name?
No, it was not. My baptismal name was Czechoslovakian.
All right.
And very few people could pronounce it correctly. And so I took this name. Actually, it was my college roommate's middle name, and her mom suggested it, so I, grabbed onto it. My mother liked the name Teresa, but there were so many versions of it. Sister Margaret Phillips said I would probably not get those names.
And you're the only Christa.
Yes, I am now,
Yes.
but you know what? There used to be a Christa that was in Sister Carol Johannes's crowd.
Oh, my. One of our former members, I presume.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, you said your roommate, where?
At Siena.
At Siena. How did you happen to get to Siena?
Well, I thought that because my parents would not allow me to enter, actually, my father was very upset. My mother kind of would go along with him.
At the thought of you becoming a religious,
sister.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, if I go to Siena, that's right next door. I could get there very easily, but it wasn't that easy anyhow. So,
yeah. Your mother and father lived where?
In the Owasso Corona area,
Mm-hmm.
and which is 2 hours north of here. So
is that German or settlement?
Initially, Irish German, and then there was a large Czech settlement that came in probably a little after they did. So that's how how my families got there, because both of the families, my mother's and my father's, one moved from Iowa and one moved from North Dakota in 1920.
Oh my!
So,
but they came from Czechoslovakia, or their parents?
Actually, the grandparents, but my father was born there. He came over as an infant with my parents, and that was because my grandfather did not want to be conscripted into the service, into the army.
Oh my!
So they left in the middle of the night on a train for Germany, and they boarded the ship at Bremen and came over.
And the rest is history.
And the rest is history.
Yes. Well, were there a lot of Czech families in the Owasso area?
Yes, many. So many that my grandfather, actually there were about 11 families that initiated building a church and having a priest minister to them that could speak Czech.
Well, how did
they could read the scriptures and hear a homily in Czech, because they could not all speak English at that point.
During your adult life, have you ever had a chance to go to Czechoslovakia to check out your roots?
Well, I did. It was kind of by accident, but when the LCWR called for sisters to, assist the women in Eastern Europe, many of our sisters volunteered, and they did teach in Hungary and so forth. I know Sister Norma Dell did, and
I think Sister Margaret Mary McGill.
Margaret Mary McGill did. Yes, a lot of them did. Several, Chris Matthews, and so I figured as long as I could speak some Czech, I will ask if I can go to the Czech Republic. So there were 3 of us that went. One was Betty Demergen, who can't speak Czech.
But she was from the Eastern.
Well, she was from Armenia, yeah, and Mideast. And then another sister who was is a Divine Providence sister. The 3 of us went to the Czech Republic, and we visited all 7 dioceses at that time.
And were you there to talk to the religious?
We did that. We talked to the bishops to see how the religious were doing, how many they had, so on and so forth. It was amazing, because it was really interesting how many groups of dedicated women who weren't necessarily vowed religious but were vowed laity, who would who existed at that point in the diocese, because we went in 1994, and that was the Velvet Revolution, which was the fall of communism, took place in 1989.
So they really had been under the thumb of the regime.
Were. That's correct. They were.
Did they have any stories to share with
They
you
had
about?
suffered greatly, and yes, they did. They had, some of them had to. Well, they were actually taken away in trucks, in the middle of the night, and they were moved to the north of Czechoslovakia. They lived in a warehouse, and they had to do manual labor right along with all the other people who were, so to speak, I think, like political prisoners. And some of them could wear their habits. Some of them were not allowed to wear their habits, and they just lived right along with all the other people. And there was an underground movement all the time because we heard about some of these people. In fact, we also visited a woman who was one of the ordained for the underground, and she was Catholic, but she was not, a religious sister, vowed sister. And she was ordained by one of the men, the priests, who was ordained a bishop for the underground. And so, it's amazing how the church could work in such a pastoral way in those countries and in many other countries. We just have this very narrow vision of what the church is like because we're used to the church in the United States. But, in other countries, it really has to adapt to the people. So.
Well, the nuns, for the most part, were to take their habit off if they were to survive. Is that correct?
Well, most of them did, yes. I don't recall exactly who it was that maybe they were allowed to leave their habits on, but most of them did remove their habits. Their convents were confiscated and used as warehouses for ammunition, things of that sort. We interviewed some sisters that were the Grey Sisters, and they were their convent was used as a prison, and that's where Václav Havel, the Czech playwright who became president right after the revolution, he was housed in that facility.
That's very eerie, indeed.
I know it is. Yes. Yeah.
Christa, I'm aware that there's a creative system or arteries or veins in you
In me, yes.
that have come out in such a beautiful way, especially with weaving. Am I correct?
Well, at one point, I thought to myself, I just would like to, tap into those creative juices of mine, and so I applied for a sabbatical, and I went to weave. And I initially started, I had asked Nancy Ann Turner about that because she was a weaver already. And she says, well, why don't you go to a workshop or something and see if you really like that? So we went to, I did go to a workshop here in Michigan, Rockford, which is just a little north of Grand Rapids. And I loved it. And so then I got a sabbatical, and I went to Haywood Tech, which is in Clyde, North Carolina. And it's only like about 15 minutes from Maggie Valley. So I thought, while I'm down there, I will join the Mid-Atlantic chapter and become a member of that so that I could participate in whatever it was that they had. And I did. It was wonderful. It took me like 15 minutes to get to a mission group meeting at Maggie Valley, and it took some of the sisters 8 hours driving to get there. But I loved the weaving. It just really was it's very relaxing
and contemplative.
And it's there just are so many things. I didn't really get deeply into the creative part of it where you can do all kinds of different things and with the looms and so forth, but I got into quite a bit, and we learned, we did some marbling on fabric, which is, a process that you just do that. You've seen that marbling that's in the fabrics and so forth. And then we also did some design and some drawing so that we would be able to, we kind of tapped into all of those areas.
Do you have a loom in your room at Regina?
No, I don't, but I did have, Nancy has the big loom I had. At least, that's what we did with it. And
Here on campus?
no, she has it in her, wherever she lives.
Oh,
Yeah.
my, I
Yeah,
think
in
she
Detroit.
said that JSU
Oh, yeah, okay.
area, yes.
And I know before she lived at Jesu in that community, she had it in the little house where she lived. But yeah, I did weave a lot of things, and the sabbatical was actually a 2-year. It was a 7-quarter program at this college, and so I was there, like 2 years and a month in between, which was wonderful. It was a wonderful gift.
What a gift, yes.
Yes.
I must offer my sympathy to you because I know you were a good friend, if not a dear friend, of Sister Nadine Foley.
Yes, yes.
You first worked with her when she was prioress, is that correct?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
I came. I had just finished. I was. What was I doing at the time? I think I had come up from a sabbatical, and I was working. I was living at the convent in Owasso for a little stint, and she called and asked if I would come up for to talk to her about this position.
Had you known her before?
No,
Oh,
not at all.
Oh, my heaven.
I never knew her at all. I just knew of her, and especially I liked what she said when she spoke at Remembering 77.
Yes, yeah.
I remember she and another priest spoke, and they talked about church and what church is and what it can do. And so I remember, going to her, and I remember in the interview saying to her, well, I mean, do you have a job description? And she says, no, a job description? And I says, well, yes. And she says, well, it would be anything I want you to do.
Coffee in the morning.
So it was, but it was very interesting. And what I really loved about Nadine, she was creative, and she, she knew that I had been weaving shortly before that, and she, I remember at one point she wanted to give gifts to the, I guess that was traditional, to their finance advisory board, and she says, but I think I'd like you to weave a throw or something. So I did. I wove, I think, 4 or 5 throws for her. She wanted to use them as Christmas gifts.
Yes.
So, I mean, she'd do things like that, give me a chance to widen my tent here and use that as part of the position.
And was there someone in that position before you got here?
Yes, Una Disi was her secretary, and she was here for 2 years. And I'm not sure what Una did after that. I think she may have been like semi-retired, but I know she worked also then in the Office of Information. She, was like the receptionist in that area.
Well, once you finished, going back to Siena Heights, once you finished your studies, you entered, I presume.
I did. I entered 3 weeks after, but I graduated, and I know my father was still not very happy, and so I thought, well, to kind of ease the transition, I invited my roommate to come in and stay with us the last week, and then she accompanied them into Adrian.
Oh, my.
And so she, and they knew her well because they knew her from the 4 years I lived with her at Siena. And she had gone home with me several times, and I with her, And so I still didn't know, like the night before I left for Adrian, I had also made arrangements with my aunt to take me in case my dad would not. Because I knew the night before I said something to him, and I said, so would you be available to, would you take me tomorrow, Dad? I said, I said, because so I could figure out what to do. And he says, you figured everything out. It just, that was it, and I thought, oh, no.
Were you the only girl in the family?
Yes.
So
it was
there
not
went the
very easy for him.
grandchildren.
That was it, right?
Yeah.
No grandchildren. And so when Eleanor and I went to bed, I still did not know whether he'd be the one to take me or I'd have to call my aunt. So in the morning, when my mother woke us up, she put a stereo record player right beside the door, and she turned it on real loud. And then she knocked on the door and said, "Come on, Dad's going to take us."
Oh, how beautiful.
So that was,
Yeah. You mentioned Eleanor. Was that...
that was her name.
Is she still
No, she's deceased.
deceased? Yeah. Okay.
She died early, like in her 40s.
Yeah. What did you major in at Siena?
Latin, and minored in math.
Did you have Sister Patrick Jerome like I did?
No, I had Sister Ellen Vincent.
Vincent.
Yeah, all 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And
yeah.
who was the president?
Well, actually, the president was Sister Benedicta Marie.
Oh, my.
And she was, well, I think Mother Gerald was the president,
Yeah.
and Sister Benedicta Marie was the vice president, vice and acting president. Because at that time, Mother Gerald was still presidents of both Barry and
Was Sister Ann Joachim on the...
Sister Ann Joachim was on the, yes, and we, would have to march in the Memorial Day parade and raise the flag, with our caps and gowns on.
Yes. Yeah.
And, she would, and I can remember she was very, very eager and involved in the city of Adrian. I remember that.
Yeah. To her credit, yes.
Mm-hmm. My roommate was a history major, so I kind of got all those little tidbits along with her. Yeah.
Well, you spent your teaching years in teaching math.
No, I taught Latin, and I taught some math, but not. I mean, that wasn't the forte. It was Latin that I taught at Rosary High, because my first assignment was to go right out to Rosary High.
Oh my! And you just went to a reunion there, didn't you?
I went to, yes.
Saturday?
Sister Helen's son and I went to a reunion, a 50-year reunion of the class of '67. And they were, my last year at Rosary, they were freshmen. And so I knew a few of them. And I had worked with one in a parish later on in Detroit that I didn't know she was in that particular class, but I knew she had gone to Rosary. But yeah, it was a wonderful reunion, and they're wonderful women. I mean, they were so grateful to have an education by the Adrian Dominicans. They said they would have never gotten into the places they did in the career world if they hadn't had the education they had. They were just most grateful.
Was Sister Mary Phillips the principal?
She was the first principal there at that. Because I came in January of '61, right after I had made profession, and she was the first principal, and then Sister Marie Henry or Adelaide Iden
God bless her.
came in as the principal, and.
Surely Felix, Sister Felix.
Oh, Felix was there, yes. Felix had gone home with me. I went home with her on a home visit, and she went home with me on my first
We used to call her Felix Namque.
Yeah. Felix Namque,
yes.
And they loved it. It was interesting, this class reunion. Their two most favorite teachers were Felix and Sister George Patrice.
Oh,
Barb Chenisek, yes.
Oh, my.
Isn't that?
Well, they were maybe more their age.
Well, I think I was more their age,
yes.
But they were involved with something very active, like the singing part, and they'd go out with Felix singing, and with Barbara Chenisek. I mean, they were involved in the art and so forth, and both of them did have homerooms, So.
Yeah, yes. Christa, I think what I am so in awe with is your embrace in dealing with pancreatic cancer.
Yeah, well, I think when I first found out I had it, it was probably a shock. And I just thought, wow. I mean, I I didn't think of dying. I didn't think of living. I just couldn't get over that I had this cancer. And I remember calling back the doctor who gave me the test and discovered it. And he says, well, hasn't your family physician called you? And I said, no. And he says, well, I called him immediately, and I gave him the information. And so I said, well, I'll call tomorrow, because I know he's not in today. It was a Tuesday, and he had the Tuesdays off. And so he said, well, I will call also. So he called, and the next morning I got this phone call, and I was to get myself ready to go see a surgeon in Toledo. And I did on that. Let me see. This was a Tuesday when I called the doctor, and then I called then he called the surgeon in Toledo, and I went 2 days later. Mary Sue Kennedy and I went and started the ball rolling, and I had the surgery.
Oh my! And the other phenomena after dealing with that for at least 5 years, you went to Kenya.
I know it. I said to the. I every year or every so often you go back every 6 months for a checkup to the cancer clinic, and so I went, and it was 5 years I was going to be released, and so I said to Heidi and Dr. Moat, I said, well, I'd like to go to Kenya, and I'm discerning this, and I said, what's the risk? And they said, well, you can't sit around and wait to die. So.
Oh, how beautiful.
So that is how I discerned. I mean, I discerned kind of fearlessly at that point, because I knew I was free at that point. So.
And who were you with? Which of
Kenya?
our sisters were you with in Kenya?
I was with Catherine Clyott and Maureen Barzantni and Renee Ritchie.
What was a highlight for you?
Well, for me, it was learning a different culture and learning that, people can live very differently and very simply, and that everybody does not have to be like the Americans and live the way we do. And it's amazing. I think I learned how much you could get along with less in life and really be happy.
Well, one of my joys on Sunday is to see the cross bearer is a woman from Kenya that was part of the orphanage where you worked.
One of our students, she's in the first graduating class, and she had been taught in photojournalism by Sister Catherine Clyott, and she got a scholarship to come to Siena, and she's in her 4th year. She will graduate this year. And she has done marvelously. She has between, I would say, 3.8 and 4.0 average all the time. She's just a wonderful student.
Amazing.
And
and she's tall and stately and beautiful.
Yes.
And her name is Purity.
Purity, right? And her good friend Mercy is down at Chestnut Hill College in Pennsylvania. So. The two of them, I just think that's interesting. Their names, Mercy and Purity. Yeah.
And Mercy there because of the connections that Bud and Sue Ozar had, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
And she also is there on a scholarship.
Yes.
So
well,
wonderful.
Do you agree with me that you have had a full life?
I do.
Exciting life.
I do.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I just marvel. I think at one of the things that I appreciate most is like the prayers of the sisters and the family members and friends when I was ill, and I mean it's their faith, the faith of the women in the community that.
And you grew up with that faith, too.
I did, yes. And it was a very simple faith. My parents were not educated in big city institutions, but, they had a deep faith and love of land and earth and where we came from.
Well, thank you for sharing so much with us today. God bless you.